Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. Today I was listening to an album just called Who. This is the most recent album by The Who. It is from 2019. I actually confused it with a somewhat earlier album called Face Dances. You can see similar kind of cover concepts here, but this is the current iteration of The Who. So we only have lead singer Roger Daltrey and guitarist songwriter Pete Townsend left, with Keith Moon, the drummer, and John Entwistle, the bass player, both having passed away years before this record. And while I have a lot of favorite Who songs, like many artists, I hadn't taken the time to really listen to their discography in full and gotten a perspective on their whole career. I guess this is going to sound like a negative thing. It feels like The Who have done lots of great things over the course of their career, but it feels like, unfortunately, they didn't happen at the same time. So at the beginning, they wrote a lot of great, catchy songs. Can't Explain, The Kids Are All Right, Happy Jack. And lots of times there was some kind of conceptual depth to them. You know, Pete Townsend was budding with ideas as a songwriter. I mentioned in an earlier video, he felt like David Bowie before David Bowie was around. But I guess the one problem with those early songs is, there was certainly a bit of a DIY sound to them, other than the sort of four core rock instruments. There wasn't necessarily something to fill them in to make them perfectly catchy. Then The Who, I guess, became big enough that they got the sort of masterful production. They started writing these songs with big, rich sound. By their fifth album, Who's Next, they also did a number of rock operas, Tommy and Quadrophenia. But while these records felt like masterfully produced, full sound things, by this point, it felt like The Who had lost interest in making sort of straightforward hits. Everything either had to be sort of musically experimental in a way to show that Pete Townsend was a composer and not just a songwriter. And the other thing that seemed to happen is somewhere, I guess, between Tommy and Who's Next, Roger Daltrey found out he was not just a good, but a great singer. Apparently, when The Who started out, Roger Daltrey wasn't even a singer. He was a guitar player, and he just filled in when their singer left because I guess he could do the job. And in their early records, they would have Pete Townsend sing songs because Pete Townsend had a high voice and they didn't want to risk having Roger Daltrey hit the high notes. And then they found out, no, Roger Daltrey is this epic singer with a huge, soaring rock and roll voice worthy of the epicness of Pete Townsend's ambitions. So as The Who's sound developed over the years, it felt like they were more invested in showing off Pete Townsend's skills as a composer and Roger Daltrey's booming voice, but had lost sight of what made them really great in the 1960s. And so finally we get to this contemporary album. And Roger Daltrey in his 70s doesn't quite have the same voice he has before, but it's sort of equally epic. It's just a lot lower, but it sort of sounds like a Johnny Cash, except with a lot of built-in vibrato, maybe a bit of a Tom Jones feel to it. Well, so it's this truly amazing dynamic voice, especially coming from an older person, but it doesn't allow for the sort of slick, easy delivery we got on some of those early hits. That said, I did really like the first song on this record, All This Music Must Fade. It felt like it brought together a lot of the good elements of what The Who had been developing, with a kind of synth poppy intro, but then Roger's voice coming in very deep and very strong. And the gruffness of Roger's voice kind of fit with the message of the song. It's kind of a cynical thing saying, well, maybe we're not hip with the times anymore, but all music will fade, so what the heck. I felt like the one thing that maybe came a bit short in this song, and maybe a bit of the record, is it felt like the drums were more on the background. And while The Who have a pretty famous drummer at this point, Zach Starkey, the son of Richard Starkey, aka Ringo Starr, he's obviously not Keith Moon. He's more of a supporting player to The Who than a member of The Who. So whereas I feel like Keith Moon had these signature kind of chaotic booming drums, Zach Starkey's just being a controlled professional in the background. And as a result, this kind of feels like The Who paying tribute to themselves rather than genuinely writing a new song. So All This Music Must Fade, pretty good, just falls a bit short of feeling like a true classic. Track number 2, Ball and Chain, is an interesting experiment in that, Roger is mostly just doing a sort of blues singing kind of thing. It's a kind of protest song about Guantanamo Bay, but then it's interspersed not with standard blues music, but with little bits of synth riff that kind of feel like they're paying tribute back to Baba O'Reilly. Track number 3 is called I Don't Want to Get Wise. The title of this song contradicts its contents. It feels like it's in the spirit of my generation. Hope I die before I get old becomes I don't want to get wise. But what this song is actually about is how they have gotten wise. They don't enjoy the same self-destructive drug habits, and maybe they don't feel like the music they made when they were younger was the work of the gods. Rock singers may be hailed, but at the end of the day, they're just people. One thing I've started to notice here is that this is really loud music. I've been listening to Who's Next on vinyl before, and I had it on the same volume when I switched to Who on CD, and it just became painfully loud at some points. And some of that I'm sure has to do with changes in technology, but it also feels like it's just this unresolved tension, that Roger's talent was this physical one. He had this huge booming voice, whereas Pete's talent was again that he had a bit of a David Bowie in him. He was this experimental, introspective songwriter, and sometimes it feels like it's just them trying to do two flashy things at once and not necessarily matching. Track number 4 is called Detour, and this one just kind of quotes the themes I've been talking about already, and there's a little throwaway to the Who's early song Can't Explain. Track number 5, Beads on the String, manages to sound a little bit different. This one tries to shake things up by adding a kind of cosmic sounding synth. And it's vaguely religious in its substance, but not in a way that I think will put anyone off. It's basically just being pessimistic about humanity and saying, there's got to be some higher source of idealism out there because, otherwise we're just going to destroy each other. Track number 6 is called Hero Ground Zero. It certainly sounds like a song with hero in the title. It revisits the idea of lionizing rock stars and making us realize that they're just people. But part of me thinks, if one is questioning all the grandeur that went into saying, how epic rock stars were, then why did they feel the need to make this overly epic music? I kind of feel like that kind of reflectiveness might be served by, maybe doing some more softer guitar stuff. It makes me wish the Who, like a lot of musicians of their generation, had done an album with Rick Rubin, where he could say, let's focus on your talent and not have all this excess. So everything is just extremely loud. Let's just focus on the beauty of Roger's voice and the beauty of Pete's songwriting. Track number 7 is called Street Song. It's hard to tell if this is just sort of like a dancing in the street is ours, let's party, or more of a, the street is ours, we're protesters kind of things. But again, the music is perhaps a bit too thick for really enjoying it as an individual piece. Track number 8 is an interesting one. It's called I'll Be Back. I thought, finally the vocals aren't over the top. And then I realized, oh, this is the one they let Pete Townsend, rather, on Roger Daltrey sing on it. It has a kind of jazzy harmonica bit at the beginning that throws in some synths, and at some points auto-tunes Pete Townsend's voice, though in a way that would probably be called artful. So it reminds me of the work that David Bowie was doing in the 1990s and 2000s. And rather than the sort of, meh, we weren't so great message we got earlier, Pete Townsend does another kind of David Bowie-esque thing and kind of splits up his identity. And he says, well, that was the past, and maybe we have been or are going to be reborn. What we're learning now is going to transcend into something else. Track number 9 is called Break the News, and I believe this one was written by Pete Townsend's brother. Unfortunately, again, this one feels like it has a bit too thick of a production, but there's something really sweet about the chorus. It kind of has a catchy 90s or later indie rock band feel to it. And then track number 10 is called Rockin' in Rage. And this feels like the Who answering my question of why don't you do a stripped down album with Rick Rubin? And it seems like the answer is, sometimes you struggle to feel relevant. Sometimes you want to keep rocking, but you're not sure if you have a message that will go over well, or if you have a message at all. And, you don't want to just feel old. You want to, if you have talent, you want to keep using it. You want to enjoy life to the fullest. And short of having an absolutely brilliant idea, you can keep rocking with their age and keep enjoying what you're doing. But then we do get a song that sounds a bit more Rick Rubin-y. Track 11, She Rocked My World. This is a kind of Cuban sounding song. And the lyrics here are sometimes pained by their literalness. There's a bit that goes, they don't mean it the way I do. They seem that they mean it like some dumb cliche, but for that certain girl, it's totally true. She rocked my world. So when I saw those lyrics on the page, I thought, it doesn't sound like that's going to be melodic. I mean, Roger Daltrey or Pete Townsend, I guess whoever did this part of the composing, found a way to phrase it so that it did fit a melody. But this kind of feels like part 2 to Rockin' in Rage, in that it's saying, okay, well, we're going to try and be more vulnerable. We're going to try and just say something about ourselves and not mask it with loud rock and roll. But sometimes it's really hard to put the human experience into words. So, like, the perfect words for describing the human experience is, she rocked my world. But that's a cliche. Is there a better way to put it? No, that's what I really felt. She rocked my world. I felt this cliche in a very real way, and I'm sorry it's a cliche because it's what I feel. So, I appreciate that as an experiment, even if it doesn't necessarily go all the way to making it a great song. So overall, I doubt this will add much to The Who's catalog, but what one can see is at very least they're still very musically talented. Roger Daltrey's voice is awe-inspiring, but again, I wonder if there's a tension there. Maybe if Roger Daltrey hadn't developed this voice midway through his career and made that his musical identity, what if instead he had the more modest voice he had at the beginning and they focused just on sort of nice lyrics and catchy little rock and roll hooks, whether they might be writing even better music today. That said, given the sound they have, at very least, I think the opening track here, All This Music Must Fade, could deserve a place in the set of Who classics. And maybe as a kind of interesting underdogs thing, I'll Be Back is another interesting one. So it's been fun listening to a lot of Who recently, and I'm looking forward to coming out with various music reviews going forward. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.